I made a simple mistake with this table and it has cost me a lot of money. I'm Patrick, welcome to the workshop. Today I'm going to be talking about this design, where it went wrong, how I fixed it, and I'll show you a few features of the table along the way. This project has been a really interesting one right from the start. A client got in touch with me and she had an old American oak table and a couple of other pieces of furniture that her father had imported from the United States when he emigrated here 30, 40 years ago. Even though this original dining table had a lot of sentimental value for this client, she could no longer fit it in her apartment and she didn't want to store it, she wanted to use it, she wanted it to be in her life, and so she asked me to come up with a way to reuse parts of the table to make her something that fitted more with her life, so she could continue to have this sentimental object and be able to use it every day. The original table design used these incredibly heavy old oak legs, which have a lot of charm. They're really unique, and the table was an extending table. It had some leaves in the center that you could take in and out, but overall the shape just didn't fit the apartment that this client was living in, and these legs no longer suited exactly what she wanted. So I may repurpose these, I may hand them back to the client. Ideally, we'll create something nice with them, but right now, these are no longer part of the design. So after removing the legs, the parts of the table that I could use were some of the leaves from the center and these half-rounded ends. These were all joined with a sort of interlocking joinery bit. The glue joins weren't fantastic, so some of them had to be reinforced. But if I had fully cut out each of those glue joins, I would have lost too much material and too much length. And then I also would have had to thickness the entire thing down even further, which would have made it thinner. The way that I reinforced some of those joins was actually by putting essentially a domino spline from the underneath on a couple of those joins that felt like they needed reinforcement. So you can see a couple of them here. Essentially, I used the domino to bore out that oval shaped hole over this glue line and then inserted the dominoes lengthways. So I reshaped them so that they acted like a spline. I did some smaller ones here and some larger ones here. Now, obviously they're still visible. It's a part of the repair. I didn't try and hide them too much. They're on the underside of the table. There are ways that I could have done this that perhaps would have been more aesthetically pleasing, even just not using a domino. But given the scale of this project, I just needed to get this stabilized and continue to move on with it. The original piece had a golden oak walnutty finish to it, similar to this dentist cabinet, which was kind of part of the job. I'm also restoring some similar old pieces for this client. But unfortunately, that surface couldn't be are used in this piece. It had been damaged too badly. There were some deep scratches. There were some places where some sort of alcohol or even a perfume had been spilt onto the shellac finish, which had just eaten it away and left this big oily stain. So I sanded the entire surface back. I didn't try and use a paint stripper or anything. And then I reapplied a stain and finish, which you can see in a previous video. You can see in the top here, there's still a couple little dings, a little indentation there, a little chip here that's caught some stain, some burn marks from someone probably dropping a candle or something on this table. All of those are evidence of its previous life, and the client was keen to retain those. So I didn't work too hard to get rid of all of those, but ultimately it did get a full refinish, and I also put a more durable hard wax finish on it with a stain. The main thing that this client wanted for this table, once it was finished, was for it to fold down to a really compact state and almost act like a part of the kitchen bench top. So I had to do a drop leaf design where these half moons fold down, and I had to create a framework underneath that allowed that to happen, but also looked really beautiful. When both leaves are dropped, it is about 600 deep, so will sit in line with part of her kitchen bench, and she can use it to place things on when she doesn't need a full dining table when she's not entertaining visitors. The point that I realized that there was something wrong with this design that I would need to fix, and it would take me a long time, was when I first set this up and opened it up like this. What I noticed is because of the way this is designed, because it's quite fluid, organic, and slender underneath, and all of these limbs come together into a central trunk, this table has a lot of radial shimmy, which means it pivots around its central column. You can see the central column is comprised of these two leg members here, joined by this bow component here and one at the top. What this means is that the weight of the table can actually bounce around that central column or that central trunk. This kind of movement is more than just the legs being wobbly or uneven. It's not because the top isn't attached to the frame. It's not even movement in the hinges of the arms, although that could be contributing. It's primarily due to actual twist in the timber. And I needed to figure out a way to stop that twisting happening, because if you put a glass of wine on that and somebody knocks it, the whole thing's coming down. In a lot of ways, radial shimmy is quite simple to fix, but actually finding a solution that looks really good is complicated. You could either just beef up all of the components and make the central core less prone to twisting because there's just more material in it. But that didn't really work for this design. The other way that you can deal with radial shimmy, and I've had to do this in another table, is you need to have some sort of diagonal bracing, because that means that the top component and the bottom component cannot twist in opposite directions because you have some diagonal bracing preventing that happening. So in that case, what that would mean is bracing from the bottom of this leg on the left to the top of this arm on the right. From there up to here. Alternatively, you could go from this leg here up to this arm here, but that would impede on too much of the airspace for people's legs when you've got people sitting at this dining table. So I grabbed some sticks of timber and I just clamped them from arm to leg to make sure that my theory was correct, and it was. That did prevent the shimmy. I tested a couple different placements, whether I could get away with just 2 of them or whether I needed 4 of them. Once I'd made sure that I knew how to fix it, I just had to figure out a way to make it look good. Because ultimately I would be bracing leg components which needed to move again when the table goes into its drop leaf position. Those 2 legs are no longer, the leg and the arm are no longer in the same position, they fold back. I needed this solution to also be removable. I needed it to look good, and I needed it to be strong enough to not have to introduce some really large, chunky timber member that took away visually from this elegant look of the table. I was disappointed that I needed to use anything at all, and I should have known better, because I've actually created a table that was too slender before. I'm always driving to achieve that elegance, and the trade-off is you have to be really sure that this thing is not going to shake, that it's going to be strong enough, because a dining table that wobbles is not a good dining table. It doesn't matter how good it looks. Okay, so my bracing needed to be removable, it needed to be thin, and it needed to look elegant. And what I came up with was some brass stays. So these brass stays are made with 9mm brass rod. Each little eyelet at the end was heated to soften the brass, and then once it had cooled down, it was hammered until that hammering hardens the brass again, and then you heat it again to soften it until I could create these little eyelets, and then they were shaped and drilled out and bent to the appropriate angle so that I could mount them from the bottom leg to the top arm in all 4 positions. And I needed a really neat way to fix these on that could be easily done by one person and that it wouldn't affect the overall visual look of the table. And what I chose was these little brass thumb screws. So the client wouldn't need tools to take these on and off. You can just do them with your fingers. And you only see these thumb screws when these stays are in place. And when the stays are not in place, you just see a little tiny insert nut, which looks like a tiny hole in the timber. Brass insert nut there, it's threaded, there's another one up there. And those 2 little dots are part of a marking system so that I know which stay goes to which arm. So that one has 1 dot, this one has 2 dots, and so on. So with those brass stays in place, this thing no longer experiences any radial shimmy. There's still a little bit of flex in the timber because it's quite a slender design, but it doesn't have that horrendous sort of twist that it did before. From a visual perspective, I think the solution is quite neat. It's quite elegant. I don't think that those brass stays take away from the design. It makes it feel a bit more deco, art deco, kind of reminds me of sort of long linear bracing in a bridge. It wasn't the original intention, but this is where we're at. I worked with the client to develop this solution to make sure that it was something that she was going to be really happy with and that I felt proud of. So the reason this ended up costing me money is because ultimately it was my fault. If the customer comes to me halfway through the project and says, "Oh, I want gold leaf on the tabletop," then that's on them and the price changes. But if I come to them halfway through the project and say, "So this table that I've designed for you wobbles in a horrendous way," that is my fault. It is my design. I've already costed the project and I'm not going to change the price. And that meant that, as well as the material cost of the brass, which wasn't that much, I had to spend time learning how to anneal and shape brass, which I'd never done before. I mean, if I'm learning something, I don't really mind investing that time because I will use that skill again. But I had to develop this solution, test it, buy all the materials for it and install it. And as well as just the time to make those brass components, there was probably a day or so in there of just figuring out, and no one pays you for the figuring out time unless you've put that in your original quote. So structural hurdles like that on a complicated table, what that means in the future is that every time something like this happens, I will sometimes put a full day of figuring out time into a design. The client won't necessarily see that itemized in the quote, but I will have put some extra time in there because inevitably, with a custom design that's this complicated and this unusual, you're going to need a day or so of figuring out time. And that is potentially one way to avoid losing money on a complicated custom piece like this. When this table is in its drop leaf position, these stays sit in these little leather hooks, so they just pivot out and the brass rods can slide right in there. Like they've done over here. Alright, a couple other notes about construction. I've actually done a couple previous videos about different parts of this build. One of them specifically was about templating these curved legs. So there's some information about how I made each of those legs. The hinges that these legs operate on are SOS hinges, which I've done a couple of videos about. You can see them mounted in there. This component here is a batten that keeps this whole top flat, and I've made a video about that specifically, so you can go back and watch that, why I've placed them there and what they're doing. All of the mounting is done with these little set screws which go into, what are they called? Insert nuts, which are up in the top of the surface here, and that's the same way the battens are mounted. A lot of the sanding for this piece, especially those internal corners here, was done with a mop sander, which I have made videos about how I made those mop sanders as well, so you can find a link to that down below also. That makes sanding any of these internal corners and tricky edges a lot easier to sand than just doing it by hand. Making custom pieces like this is one of my favorite things to do. Inevitably, on every custom piece that is made from scratch and I've never made before, there is some part of it which I don't get paid for. As I go along, I try and adjust my prices to make sure that I'm being compensated for some of that brain time. But it's really unpredictable whether that's going to be a half day or 3 days. Depending on how much work you have coming in, it's not always possible to add 3 days of mystery time onto a job, and it's not necessarily fair to the client either. So you need to figure out as many of those unknowns beforehand, and ultimately you need to accept that some of the learning process you're going to pay for yourself, which is not an incredibly sustainable way to run a business. However, it is enjoyable. I love making these pieces, and the customer is hopefully going to really enjoy this and then recommend me to her friends so I can lose money on other projects. Thanks for watching. I really hope you got something out of it. And I hope this really tied up a whole bunch of those other videos that I've done on this piece along the way. There'll be links down below to those videos that feature different techniques for this project, as well as some of the products I've used. Watch out on my social media at Douglas Fir Design for finished photos of this piece. And like the video, follow our channel, it helps us out. I'll see you next week.